So good afternoon, everybody. I am Andy Rich. I am Dean of the Colin Powell School, which is the School of Social Sciences at City College. And I want to welcome you to a conversation with Corey Robin. Corey is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is a distinguished author of 3 books. The most recent, The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, which came out just last fall with Henry Holt. He's written scores of articles and essays. And today's session is about one of his most recent essays, an essay that was published in The New Yorker earlier this month, entitled "The Pandemic is the Time to Resurrect the Public University." On the day Corey's New Yorker piece was published, I gotta say at least 10 people shared it with me in about 3 hours. And I think from that day, I've sensed that it kind of caught the attention of many who had a chance to read it. It struck a nerve about a conversation that so many of us thinks needs to be happening here at CUNY and happening about public higher education more generally. And yet it's a conversation that seems all too often missing from what's going on in this city, what's going on in national discussions, and what's being discussed by policymakers. Corey writes, quote, "For decades, a handful of boutique colleges and powerhouse universities have served as emblems of our system of higher education. If they're not the focus of discussion, they're the subtext, shaping our assumptions about the typical campus experience." He goes on, "In academia, as in the rest of society, a combination of public and private actors direct wealth to those who need it least. While CUNY struggles to survive decades of budget cuts and faces in the pandemic the possibility of even more. Donors are lavishing elite colleges and universities with gifts of millions, even billions of dollars." So today's session is not directly about the particulars of what seem like impending budget cuts, but it's about the conversation that so many of us wish we were having instead of that, which is about how we returned from the days of austerity to the days when CUNY was more highly valued. How do we restore City College and CUNY to a place where in the last decade it produced more Nobel laureates than any institution but Harvard, and make it understood as the kind of robust institution of higher education that it was for so many decades in the last century. So with that, let's get into it. We have a great audience, and we want to have opportunities for everyone to ask questions. We are muting everybody as you come in. We will handle questions over in the chat space. So I invite you, as you have them, to share your questions over in the chat space. My colleague, Debbie Chang, is moderating the Q&A. So share your questions there as you have them. And then when we get to the Q&A, we'll share them with Corey. We'll spend the first portion of the event with Corey and me in a bit of a conversation. So first, Corey, thank you. Welcome. And can you just start off, tell us a little bit more about you, about your connections here to CUNY, how long you've been here, kind of what your context is for writing about CUNY, and then specifically why you wrote this essay.
Sure. Well, first of all, everybody, thanks for being here. I've heard from some of you who have sent emails, and I was really both touched and surprised, and just, you know, the connection I felt around this piece, I really am grateful for. I've been at CUNY, this is my 21st year. I came here in 1999. So I've been here a long time at Brooklyn College, and I also teach at the Graduate Center in Political Science. The piece actually, believe it or not, originated as a Facebook post. And there were 2 things going on for me. One was, and I don't know any other word to use for this except grief, over the death count at CUNY. And, you know, and seeing that it was not being reported virtually anywhere. At the time that the piece came out, the number was 23, but when I first posted about this on Facebook, I think I had thought it was something like 14. And I thought to myself, just the thought occurred to me, you know, if this had been Harvard, this would have been front page news in the New York Times, and it just was not being reported at all. I should say, at the time that the piece came out, the number was 23. It has since gone up, that I know of at least, we're at 30. And again, we have no central accounting of this. And so one of the deliberate decisions I made early on when I turned it into an article was to say, I insisted that we had to have the list of names at the end of the piece, because that really was part of what this all began as, was just this genuine, sense of loss, and feeling that nobody was accounting, or at least memorializing it. So that was one part of what inspired this. The other was this op-ed in the New York Times by the president of Brown, Christina Paxson, which I discuss in the piece, which got a tremendous amount of attention. And it was all about the need to open up the campuses back up in the fall. And while a lot of the attention of that piece was focused on what seemed a kind of heartless calculus at the heart of the piece, where financial considerations seemed to be uppermost, what I was more struck by was the unspoken class biases and assumptions. The physical architecture of what the president of Brown was talking about in terms of the possibilities of opening up, and that includes, systematic daily contact tracing and testing. If students got sick, quarantining them in a hotel room, and all of these things that were being spelled out. And I mean, all of us are laughing, I can see on the screen, because we know how insane and exclusive such a conception is. And what's even more maddening, I think, and was for me, and I think for all of us, is these articles are written, and this is just one of a genre that I've seen over the years. They are written as if they are universal statements of what everybody would do across college campuses and universities across the country. And, I don't know what conditions are like at your particular CUNY campus, if you're teaching or an administrator or a student there, but at Brooklyn College, they're not great. And so that really brought about, and if I could just have one little detour, it's just a tangent on this. It reminded me, a few years back, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by a professor at Columbia who was teaching in one of these prison education programs that a lot of universities do. And she was describing, she taught at an upstate prison somewhere in upstate New York. And she said, I know I'm in the prison when I'm teaching. And she proceeds to itemize a set of features at the prison: very loud radiators clanging, overheated rooms, chalkboards where there's no chalk and you can't write. And she's going through the list. And I'm thinking, Brooklyn College, Brooklyn College, Brooklyn College, Brooklyn College. But that to her signified prison. And I want to be careful here. I don't like people who make comparisons between a university and prisons, which some people do. But I do feel like the hidden assumptions of the discourse. And I'll just sort of step back for 1 second here. And if I'm talking too long, Andy, feel free to cut me off. As I said, this is a long-standing problem in the media, where these very elite schools and spokespersons and people who teach or are students at these elite schools drive the discourse, and to people, this is what higher ed is, what's going on here at Columbia or what's going on there at Harvard, and they bear no resemblance at all to what goes on at CUNY. And that's partly why I felt like it was so important to get into the nitty-gritty, the physical details of what it's like to wash your hands in a bathroom at Brooklyn College, how difficult it is. Because I think this is unimaginable to the people who, write these articles and read these articles. And it's not just a media problem. And this is the final point I want to make. It reflects a political reality, which is that we, CUNY, and public higher ed are invisible in a lot of the policymaking around education and in the distribution of resources around education. In other words, that invisibility in the media is replicated in the invisibility of how resources are distributed. It's not just a symbolic, discursive, media problem. it's an actual political economy problem. And the media is simply a reflection of this. And I want to say, because I think we've lived with this for so long, it becomes to seem like a trans-historical reality, that this is new. This is new. This has not been, I'm not a historian of higher ed, but from what I do know, there was a kind of parenthesis in the post-war American era, which had a lot of problems. And I don't want to romanticize or valorize this, this moment between, 1945 and let's say 1980. But there was a moment, I think, where institutions like CUNY commanded the spotlight more. And not just commanded the spotlight, but received some share of the resources more. And you see it in all sorts of ways. Last fall, I taught the Republic, Plato's Republic, in my Intro to Political Theory class. And we taught alongside that Huey Newton's Revolutionary Suicide. And Huey Newton talks about going to community college in Oakland, Merritt College, and then arguing in the street with his friends on the block about David Hume and Peirce and William James. And, and what's so clear about that story is that he's not singular. He's not, I mean, he is an individual, but it is built on top of this massive infrastructure and investment that created, in part, post-war American culture, that makes American culture unthinkable. People love to talk about the New York intellectuals, Daniel Bell and Nathan Glazer, who retired at Harvard, but as many of you know, where did they get their start? City College. Frank Lloyd Wright, Lorraine Hansberry, all these people were products of state university systems. And so I say all this, again, not to be romantic about the past and not to be sort of sad about it, but simply to say that the situation we are currently in is not trans-historical. It is recent. It was made by a series of decisions. And if it was made, it can be unmade. But the first thing is to sort of disenthrall ourselves from the present and to stop seeing that the way things are now is the way they have always been and must always be. And so I think those were, it began, as I say, as a Facebook post, but then got into something a little bit bigger than that.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, it goes to a bit what you were just saying, but you point out in the piece, that it was the Great Depression that led to an investment in creating Brooklyn College and Queens College, that it was, it was a different political moment, but a different social moment too. And as you say, one tied to a kind of more complex and different understanding of political economy and where higher education fit in. And I do think there's this question of, is this a CUNY problem? Is this a higher ed problem? Or is this a set of problems in our society in both kind of the ideological currents and the political currents and how they inform decision-making?
I think it's clearly a problem in the society, but before I get into that, I want to just have a caveat, because I think sometimes when you start talking about broad social problems that are systemic and structural, there is a tendency to then feel like, well, we have no agency here, and these decisions are beyond us. They are, rooted in these larger systems and structures. Therefore, well, what can I do? I'm just a cog in the machine. And I want to come back to that problem, because I think it's a huge problem, this pervasive sense of helplessness that we all have, and this sense that somebody else is going to decide things for us. So that's the caveat I want to open with, but clearly this is a systemic problem. And, we could talk about it at all sorts of levels. I'm a political theorist, and I try to stick to the things that I know. And I will just say it this way, and try to be simple about this. I mean, Andy, you talked about all the Nobel Prize winners that we've had at CUNY. And I think one of the problems, and this is a small window, I think, on a bigger problem, is our view of achievement and genius and the people who make these great contributions, and we think they are singular. We think that, the goal is to find that diamond in the rough, and then promote them up the pipeline and get them to Harvard and get them to Yale and get them to these elite institutions. And it's such a screwed up view of culture and cultural production. And I say this is not, I believe there are people who make singular achievements and contributions to the culture. I don't deny that. But the seedbed for that are these types of institutions like CUNY and like the state university system, these mass institutions that are necessary for that. One of the other books that I taught this year, this term was Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And she talks about, and she was a complete elitist, but she talked about how, women of genius only come to exist when there's this broad infrastructure around them that makes that possible. And I feel like we live in the moment where the society believes you tap an individual of genius or greatness, at a very young age, and then you give them all the resources and that's it. And everybody else gets crap. And set aside the social justice of that, but just as that's not how you produce culture. And I feel like this is the moment we're in right now, where I wouldn't say the general consensus. I think the belief is that you want to match resources with greatness, and everybody else can go to hell. And that just doesn't work. And again, it's a horrifying proposition at the level of social justice, but it's also not the way you build an economy. It's not the way you build a society. And I think that's really, I would say that's really the problem, the sort of the broad ideological problem we face. And part of challenging this is going to involve telling a different kind of story, I think. And that story has to be about that you can't isolate resources to the few. I mean, we're seeing this right now in the economy. We've had almost no growth or very low growth on this premise that if you give resources to the few, that somehow they can, make more. But we know that that's not true. And it's also not true in culture as well.
So let me ask you, I mean, both to your point about, we don't want to talk in such broad terms that we lose touch with kind of what agency we might have to change things, but also to your last point, how would you articulate the value proposition that CUNY offers in our society? Because I think sometimes, we talk about, at City College, we talk a lot about it being an engine for social mobility. We talk about, being a place for all people. But then we also at times, I think, use language that suggests we want to think of ourselves or compete in some sense in a kind of R1 environment, and that we're not always as clear as we might be about, so what is the value proposition, not just of CUNY, but CUNY particularly matters in this conversation, but public urban institutions as different from, say, state flagship institutions, as different from large private research institutions.
I feel this is where I feel a little bit out of my league, to be honest with you, because, gosh, I mean, I think you've identified some of the key contributions of a public university system, especially like CUNY. And I don't know if that I would have, much beyond the things, I think both the question of social mobility, which I think is hugely important. And it was one of my frustrations, again, that led me to this article, the focus on elite institutions as the engines of mobility. And, I think that's a huge problem. And CUNY obviously, I mean, and there's been reporting on this in the New York Times, even the New York Times about this. So I think the question of social mobility, I think, is pretty clear. I think I'm more interested, and I'm not the person making the case to state legislators, for instance. So I don't know what arguments work, and would defer to people who are in those conversations. But I do think that the question of culture is hugely important. And we lionize all these people and these institutions, like I said, the New York intellectuals and all these figures, but where did they come from? And so I think the story of the public education creating American history is not a well-known story, particularly at the level of higher education. And so I think for me, that would be where I would start, is the post-war American history is unthinkable without these institutions. And, you could go through them, of people who got their start in them and what they did for people. And the kind of the transformative effect. And this is always a hard argument, I think, because you make this against a budget argument, and it seems, kind of ethereal, and not nearly as evidentiary based. It seems more anecdotal. But the truth of the matter is, public institutions like CUNY weren't built by hard numbers only. They were built by a different narrative of what is it that makes an American society go. And I think we have to really begin there, which is that it's not something that happens at the top, and it's not something that happens because you find a couple of diamonds in the rough at the bottom. It's something that really is a mass proposition, and has been, and was until a fairly recent moment in time.
And what, a lot of the discussion we're having is a conversation we could have had about CUNY in January. And I wonder, your title, the title of your piece is "The Pandemic is the Moment." What does the pandemic, for all of its harms to CUNY and to our society, what is the opportunities this moment potentially presents for us?
The word crisis always gets deployed a lot, and it has its origins. I see Joel Allen is here on the call. I'm a little bit nervous to say this because he's a classicist, but it has its origins in the ancient Greek, and the word krisis, I can't pronounce it, but it was connected to the verb krino, I believe. Joel can correct, Professor Allen can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a verb that means to decide, to make a decision. And crises are moments when people have to make choices and take certain paths. And that's just a fact. And I think there really are kind of, at this point, I think we're at a very clear juncture. And there are two ways we can go. We can continue on the path we're on. There's been some discussion of budget cuts, which I very briefly allude to in my piece. And there's a piece out in today's New York Times by my colleague at Brooklyn College, Ben Lerner, about the impact of those cuts. We can go down that path that we have been going down. We can keep doing what we have been doing. But I would challenge that because I don't know if you can cut your way to solvency anymore. I think that was an illusion at one point. I don't know that we can do it. So for me, that path is really a path towards ending the institution. And we should be clear about that. So that's one way you can go. That is one decision we can make, is to say, you know what? This was this nice experiment we had for a while, and now we're going to end it. And I really think that's what the budgetary cut path is, because there's no other way to get solvency except to just eliminate the institution at this point. Or you could take a very different path. And this is where I think the story of the Depression is relevant. And I mentioned in my piece that, the Brooklyn College, Queens College, were built during the Depression at a moment of crisis when a different path was taken. And I just want to say one more thing about the Depression and that story, which is, we think of the New Deal, right, the 1930s. The New Deal actually began in New York State 20 years earlier. It began with Francis Perkins and people like Robert Wagner. Francis Perkins, who was later in the New Deal, the FDR administration, who was a professor of sociology at Adelphi at the time in 1910, 1911, when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened. And what did she do? She advocates for health and safety legislation that the New York State Senate then passes. And that's where Robert Wagner, who is later the author of the Wagner Act in the New Deal, but that's where he gets his start. And so they had a crisis, this horrible calamity, this fire. And what did they do? They decided to build. They decided to build. And I think that's really the choice. I think we're really at a juncture here, and I think it's very critical. And I think the path of cuts is the path of death. And I don't think it's an exaggeration. That's the path that many people would like, is for us to disappear. And I don't see us cutting our way to save the institution. I would like somebody to make that case to me, because I don't see it. So that's one path. The other, which I think, is the preferred one, is to build and to make an investment. I'm not an economist, but I've been reading a lot of John Maynard Keynes lately. And, that this is one of the points he always came back to about public investment, is that you're taking a part of the social wealth that is out there, and you're setting it aside for a good that wouldn't otherwise be provided for. And it has to be done through public means, through the state. There's no other way. And you're taking a portion of that and you're saying, we're dedicating it to this value that we think is important on its own and that will reap unknown returns in the future. And once you do it, he said, it's there. And I think that is, I think that's the choice. And I think it's a choice that the pandemic has. I think it was there before. So I think I totally agree with you, Andy, that it was there in January. But I think this has now brought it out very, very clearly. And the fact that we have so many people dying at CUNY, but not at a place like Columbia or NYU, shows you the value that people currently have about the institution. And I think budget cuts and further cutting is in line with those values. And that's why I say I think it's a path towards death. Mm-hmm. And I prefer a different path. And I think many of us do as well.
So two questions on that. And I want to invite folks to, I think there's a lot going on in the chat. And if you have questions, feel free to please start sharing them there or continue to share them there. And we'll go to those in just a minute. But let me ask you two follow-ups on what you just said. Because one, I'm recognizing that you're not an expert on higher education. This isn't what you study. It just happens to be an essay you wrote, but you have experienced CUNY and you're a political scientist. And so I wanted to ask you maybe from both sides. On the political science side, I'm curious whether what's the ideological environment in which a productive case for public higher education can be made right now? And you just came out with another essay or a piece in Polity about how the left can reclaim freedom. And I'm wondering kind of where higher education available to all perhaps kind of builds on that. And frankly, also just kind of what we're seeing in what could ultimately be a post-Trump American politics that has, the effects of ideas from people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And then second, going back to, the agency, how do we, whether the ideological currents are there or not, or to the extent that they are, how do we actually harness them, right? So we've talked about agency, but just from your perspective, having been at CUNY for 20 some odd years, how do you think, how could at all levels, could the institution be engaging this conversation in a more productive way?
Well, I mean, so I have been here for a long time, and part of the joy of being here for a long time is I got to be chair of my department for a period of time. And one of the things I noticed is that, and I think this is true of institutions in general, but it's very true at CUNY, is that we pass the pain downward. That's the way decisions are oftentimes made. So, you get a cut from above and then you inflict it below. And that's the first reflex. And again, I'm not at the highest levels of the administration, but I've seen how this works, at least, at one institution. And I think the first thing we have to do is try to figure out how to pass the pain back up at every level. and to make, in other words, to make people feel the effect of what ultimately it is students and adjuncts and faculty and custodians and administrators too. I mean, I think everybody's kind of in this together, are feeling, because I think too, we are these sort of passive recipients too often. And I know, there are all kinds of arguments and so on that go forward, but I think it has to go way, way back up. And let me just say one other thing related to that is something I alluded to earlier. I've been noticing in a lot of the conversations, there's an awful lot of waiting for Cuomo. We have to wait for Governor Cuomo to decide. And there's just something odd about that when you think about it. There's so much criticism that Trump is an authoritarian and has all power and all the rest of it. But I work at an institution where everybody thinks one person in this state decides everything. And I find that astonishing. We have a state legislature. We have multiple levels of bureaucracy that, the fact that we think this is this one guy who does everything, we then partake and participate in that acquiescence. And this is one thing I can say as a political scientist, that these forms of power never work unless people acquiesce in them. They can't work otherwise. Fran Piven, who is, one of our great treasures, we talk about treasures of CUNY, talks about this all the time. She's a professor at the Graduate Center in poli-sci, now retired. But these forms of power can't work without our acquiescence. So I think those things are important. And that is a long-winded way of getting to your question about the ideological environment. I would say that there's never a hospitable ideological, oh, that's not true. There are sometimes more hospitable ideological environments, but they need to be created. And I think that's what we need to do. And I do think, I'm reluctant to say what particular argument, should we push, because I think there are people more experienced than I am on this particular front, particularly with higher education. But I do think, this is something that Andy and I have talked about a lot, that the language of freedom and education as freedom, as emancipation. Education as emancipation. I mean, that is one of the oldest stories in American history. I taught Frederick Douglass just a couple of weeks ago, and the centrality of education and of reading to freedom is so important, and it's such an available vernacular in American history that I do think that could be a good argument. But I think that's more of a conversation we should have as to what kind of ideological arguments work. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Maybe two last questions, and then we'll open it up. We've been talking a lot about CUNY, and I suspect we'll keep talking a lot about CUNY in this conversation, but you do make the point in the article that 2017 was a watershed. It was the first year public colleges and universities began to receive more revenue from tuition than from the state, which I think you're referring to. This is the case nationally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, I mean, you're quite right to argue, we collectively need to fight this, take this on, really understand this is a project that we have to engage in. But we're talking about something that's not just about in New York, but it's really happened across the country. And you talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but how do you see us as having been able to get to this point where it's almost, I mean, as you say, we could debate how to connect this into kind of the ideological currents in American politics. But the interesting thing is we're not even having in most state capitals very coherent and even existing debates. We're just not talking about higher education in a significant way. And we're not in Washington, it's really been absent, although now it seems to have come up, although in a mostly negative light. And I'm just curious how you figure all that in.
I think you just touched something in my head here. At moments like this, at moments of health crisis, and I've heard people say this, something like education seems like a frill. It's like, it's the thing you take care of after you've taken care of the job crisis, the jobs crisis, the health, the public health crisis, all the rest of it. And I suspect many people, including many of us, would feel, am I really going to go to the state legislature and say, you've got to fund CUNY, when they're saying, I'm trying to figure out which part of Medicaid or New York City schools, K through 12 to cut, and you're going to tell me that, you've got to have English literature and chemistry at, in colleges and all the rest of it. And it's a very awkward moment. And so I think part of it, of how we've come to this is that somehow or another, education has come to be viewed as a frill. And again, I was just thinking when you said that, your comment made me think of Virginia Woolf, because this is how she opens a room of one's own. She's, why are these women's colleges so the food is terrible there, the grounds are terrible. And she said, we view it as a frill. But in fact, it's a frill. It's a frill that reflects a much, much deeper reality. The fact that Harvard is so fancy and attentive. I don't know if anybody has seen it, but a couple of days ago, the president of the University of Pennsylvania put out a plan for the fall, and she talked about, and it's a very interesting and thoughtful plan, I should say. But the loving care and attentiveness to the health and safety of those students is reflective of the value that society places upon those students. And so I guess this is a long-winded way of saying is the things that we think of as frills are reflective of, it's not reflective of the value we put on education. That's not what it's reflective of. It's a reflection of the value we put on working class people, Black people, Latinos. That's what this is really about. It has nothing to do. And if working class people aren't getting a good education, they're also not getting good healthcare. And they're also not getting good jobs. So I think we have to kind of break through a little bit this notion that somehow education is different and apart and a kind of a frill thing, because that's not what this is about. It's about who gets the goods, the basic goods of social life. Is it rich, mostly white people? Or is it everybody? I mean, it's a pretty simple, I hate to be sentimental and sappy about this and simplistic, but it is ultimately quite simple. If you can do this at Penn and devote so much care to those students, there's only one reason for it, is because you value those lives more. And the reason you value those lives more is because they come with more money. Like it's that. So, gosh, I don't even remember how we got to this question, but anyway,
No, that answers it though. And we'll go, Debbie, we'll come over to you in just a second for questions. But last thing I wanted to just ask was, you mentioned something about this at the very beginning, but what has been the reaction to the essay, and what has surprised you about the reaction?
It's been universally, I mean, I don't think I've ever written anything that's gotten so much response, personal response to me also. Like, I'm still digging out from the emails. And what's interesting is I'm getting a lot of emails from presidents and chancellors of state systems and of state universities. I usually hear from people like me, other professors or activists or something like that. But I'm hearing from an awful lot of administrators. And so I think we all believe this. I don't think we think differently. And the question is, okay, we all believe this, so this has to be communicated. And it's not just up to one person, or something in the media. It has to be communicated in a very different kind of way. And it's not just a question of, and I say this not with the belief that if you make the better argument, you win. I don't think that's the way the world works at all. Although don't tell my students that. But there's an awful lot of people who believe this, who are in positions, of power. And so again, this means that the argument needs to be passed upward, and we have to stop passing the pain downward, and maybe pass a little bit of that pain back up with the argument as well.
Debbie, Want to share some of the questions that?
Sure, yeah. So there's a lively chat, lots of questions and comments in the chat box, but I'm going to try to summarize a little bit. So there's one thread around this set of questions. Given these sound and strong arguments, why is it that CUNY is systematically under budgeted by city and state governments? Is it possible that we, the institution, need to better build our direct value to local government? And related to these, you know, there's a question or a comment, given the animosity that Cuomo seems to have toward CUNY, what are the levers to change that tune? There's a tension between CUNY, which is caught up in chronic conflict between city and state government, and CUNY's relationship to SUNY. And there are many revenue bills in the state legislature, realistic ways to raise revenue, but Cuomo doesn't seem to be interested. So I wonder if you could speak to these questions about how we address under budgeting at the city and state government level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on New York State or New York City politics, and certainly not an expert on budgets. So I'll speak to what I know, which is not a lot on this topic, I should say. But I'm just struck again by the theme, the thread of those questions, which is, well, Cuomo is against it. You know, Cuomo is a governor, and there is a state legislature. And I understand that, you know, he has quite a bit of power in that state legislature, but none of the things that were done in the past began and were done because, you know, the governor wanted to do it. Like, that's not how anything ever happens in the world. So the argument on its face has very little plausibility to me. Of course he's against it. Most powerful people are against these things. They always have been. So the question is how to find sources of power and leverage in spite of that. And, you know, I think there is moves afoot with the state legislature, you know, with more progressive members of the state legislature. And I mean, there were, you know, there were 6 new state legislators that were elected, or 5 or 6, Democrats who knocked out the kind of more conservative parts of the Democrats. I mean, maybe this is already happening and I don't know about it. And I should say, I should preface again, you know, there's nothing more annoying than an academic who says, you should do this. And it's like, yeah, we've tried that 1,000 times and, you know, you just haven't been paying attention. So I don't want to be that person here. But it is interesting that there have been so many grassroots mobilizations to elect new state legislators, some of which have been successful. And a lot of those efforts at mobilization are not necessarily being done by progressive unions. They're being done by other groups. And so those legislators are not accountable to an institution like CUNY. I mean, I'm sure they believe in it, but they're not accountable. And so I think we have to start creating more forms of electoral accountability is one thing, with people who are sympathetic and feel like they owe their political career and their life to us. Like, you know, there is a transactional nature of electoral politics and it's important. And we've got to do that. So that's one part. But then, of course, the other is genuine mass protest and disruption. And, you know, this gets us into more, you know, difficult and controversial areas. But, you know, I always have an ambivalence about, you know, writing something because I feel like, oh God, you know, yet another well-intentioned article, yet another strongly worded email, you know, yet another eloquent letter. You know, for God's sakes, we've done this so many times. And what we have not done is exercise the muscle of mass disruption. And how that works and what form that takes, you know, we can leave for another day. But, you know, it's those two things, like developing forms of electoral accountability with elected officials who are genuinely progressive and not in name only, and who feel like they owe their political career to a very clear constituency that is us. And by us, I mean all the students and faculty and workers at CUNY. And then, you know, forms of mass protest. And I just think we should block out of our discussion, Cuomo doesn't want this. Like, we know that. That's the condition that we're trying to overcome. That is not the baseline of what we do. And once we accept that as the baseline, we might as well pack up and go home. Like, it's over then.
All right, there's another question that says, Scott Galloway from NYU just argued on Anderson Cooper's show that many higher education institutions are about to enter a death march soon because of the massive inflation of their tuition while not changing their product for decades. Is this the other side of the coin of the argument that investment in public institutions is needed? Do we also need to reinvent to survive?
Well, I guess I would slightly rephrase that. I mean, I have thought that, the public is going to be increasingly both intolerant, but also unable to pay the levels of tuition at these private schools that they have been paying. I mean, it was already a kind of Potemkin village to begin with. And it's going to, I think the pandemic has just, the kind of exigency that it has brought about, I think people are just not going to be willing to pay that kind of stuff and incur that kind of debt. But rather than saying that CUNY should then reinvent itself, with the way Galloway was talking about, more online stuff and all the rest of it, I think we now have the possibility of saying, hey, guess what? Like, we can offer everything that you were told about an education, but it's not as expensive. And it's, it happens to be quite good, in fact. And look at, and here's where the story of CUNY and all the rest of it, look at all these people who got their start at CUNY and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm always shocked by the number of people who would be willing to pay that kind of money for what they're doing. So I think it is an opportunity, but not in the way that guy was talking about. And I read that interview online. I think it's an opportunity for us to say, we actually can provide a liberal arts education without a lot of the bells and whistles, and in a much more kind of cost-effective way. But I should say, I hope this doesn't then become a kind of run for tuition money, because I think that's equally unsustainable. We're hanging on a thread by tuition money. And we also need real investment. And my hope is that there is now a constituency for that, both because of the crisis that we're in, and the fact that these other forms of private universities are not going to be really available as much for people anymore.
Well, here's a devil's advocate question that's related.
Oh, I hate those. Okay.
If the problems we have experienced in CUNY are a pattern that has been driven by our dependence on public funding, which is being cut exogenously, and if our problems stem also from the notion that everything depends on the decisions of one person, which we have agreed it doesn't, Cuomo, then why isn't the solution to our CUNY problem to wean ourselves off tax levy as much and as soon as possible?
Well, in a way, that's what has been going on. For many, CUNY used to be CUNY used to operate entirely from tax levy money. And now, I mean, I don't, know what the exact figures are, but we are increasingly funded by tuition money and whatever kind of private donations we can get. But I think we're seeing what the results of that has been. And it's getting ever smaller. So the notion, I mean, that's just to say, let's keep doing more of what we've been doing, which seems insane to me. That's how we got to a situation where I can't wash my hands at Brooklyn College. So that just seems, like if you're in a hole, keep digging. It does not seem like a good strategy or a solution to me.
Can I ask a follow-up on that kind of connects the two questions, which is, which again builds on this pandemic as a potential moment of, say in political science terms, a realignment potentially, or, and a moment when we could have a new and different kind of appreciation for what government's responsibilities are and how government works on all fronts, including in higher education. And so I wondered your thoughts on that, which would not be doing business as usual. And also, a conversation I guess I've heard is going on in Washington, which is, if some of the failures in private higher education that people are predicting happen in some form. I mean, I think that kind of the doomsday scenarios have now stopped being kind of promoted quite as loudly, at least for the moment. There's a set of folks being led by Betsy DeVos who would argue, well, this is the moment for for-profit higher education. Like this, in other words, that we're going to reach if this is a moment for realignment, we could go one way or another, generally as a society and including as we think about higher education. And the other path would be a reinvestment in public higher education, a real understanding that this is public good, tied to all the things you said earlier matter in our society.
Right. So, for those of you who don't know, so realignment is a kind of is a poli-sci political science concept, and I'm going to talk just briefly about it because I actually do find that it's not a way that most people outside of political science think about politics, but for many of us in the discipline, it's quite central and it's important. I think most people just, like I said, we have these very ahistorical ways of thinking. We just think this is the way it's always been, or it's just kind of like one damn election after another. And it's like, great if Obama is elected, bad if Trump is elected, great if this one is. And it's just this kind of, it's either this, everything is always the same, or everything changes with every election in, whatever random way. And the way we think about it in political science is, no, there are these critical moments when a fundamental change happens that sets the terms for decades to come. So 1932, the election of FDR was one. 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan was another. 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln. And these are these moments when there's a shift in the electorate and a change in the policies and the kind of ideological structures of the conversation. So much so that even the people who are opposed to that new language find themselves speaking that language. And what I mean by that is Margaret Thatcher was famously asked, what is your greatest accomplishment? And people thought she was going to talk about, this thing with taxes or that. And she said, Tony Blair. Tony Blair is my greatest accomplishment. Why? Because he was a member of the Labour Party speaking my language. And that's when I knew I had won. And so that's what we mean by a realignment, is when, the discourse so changes that even the people who are formally opposed to it end up speaking back that language. And there has been some discussion that we are in such a moment of realignment. And I won't get into all the specifics, but I think there's some evidence for this. And in fact, I was working on a piece on realignments for the New Yorker before this whole thing came up. And so I'm hoping to get back to that. But I do think that is how we have to be thinking, that this is a kind of moment where you kind of need to start from the ground up. You need to start you need to start making the fundamental case, not trying to like parry this budget cut here with this small argument there, but a more fundamental restructuring with the faith that there is a constituency out there that is ready. And I think we see signs of this. But this is a long-term project. This is not something that happens, by November. And I think we have this opportunity because it's so clear that the existing ways of doing things aren't working for a lot of people. And I think that's an opportunity for us to really start making the case for something more fundamental. And I think, the Betsy DeVos program of for-profit, in a way, I see that just as an extension of the elite nonprofit school model. I mean, there's the old joke, Harvard is not a university, it's an investment fund with a real estate operation on the side. Or, I'm sorry, it's an investment fund with a university on the side, excuse me. Or, at Yale, they would say it's a real estate operation with a university on the side. These are very similar to for-profit institutions. They just amass wealth and keep it to themselves. So I don't think a for-profit model for education is really that different. And it will not deliver, and we know this, and we just need to, make the case, the kind of educational goods, the kind of things that we talk about for an education, to, and this is the key point, many, many people. We are trying to serve a lot of people, and far from that being a bad thing, that's a good thing. And we have to explain to people why that is.
Here are two questions that address some maybe possibilities for realigning. Two separate questions. So first, why not conceptualize education as K to 16? Families and means think of public education as K to 12 because college is different, private, out of state, etc. So only people of modest means assume they'll be commuting to college. And the second takes on a different tone. I think the racism in this needs to be acknowledged. When CUNY was built, the populace that it was envisioned to serve was very different than the majority of the population currently being served. Private institutions are also a means of the elite self-segregating, furthering the systemic inequality. So how would you respond to those two issues?
I think the second is quite true, and there's been a lot of very good scholarship on that issue. I sometimes get a little bit slightly concerned about the second because it doesn't acknowledge, and again, I'm just, was coming back to that Huey Newton, those post-war institutions, in California, for instance, which is not just the UC system, but the Cal State system, really were engines for not just white middle-class people, but for many, many different groups. And so I don't want the history to be so rewritten that we forget that. I like that idea of K through 16, and I think it's a great one. And I mean, this goes with the whole free college now movement that I think has begun. And again, I think the arguments for that are getting stronger and stronger. I mean, I think the student debt issue is not sustainable, and so I think there is a ready constituency for that.
All right, well, CUNY's funding could come from a wealth tax. The city has millionaires and billionaires who left New York for second homes. They have resources, so we could find resources. We could find revenues from those resources. A related question, there are 160 of us now, there were a few more before on this call. What action are we gonna do to align the actual resources of New York City and New York State with right and wrong?
Oy. Well, I mean, in terms of the first, absolutely. There is, and again, there's just when we talk about wealth, and this is why I keep coming back to Keynes, because I think he really, in political science, the term for the state, before it was called the state, was often the Commonwealth. And, you still see that in the Commonwealth of Great Britain and all the rest of it, or the United Kingdom. And I think what that means is that we all, it means a couple of things. One is that we all produce wealth. Two, wealth is not just money, but much more than money. And three, that it should be shared. And I really, when we talk about wealth taxes, it's not just a budgetary issue. It's not just like there's a lot of money there and we should put it to this. It's really about whom does wealth belong to, who produces it, who shares in it, and what are you investing it in? That money that money is not just sitting under somebody's pillow. It's being invested to certain purposes. And the question is whether or not public education for many people is a worthwhile goal. I think all of us believe that it is. And that's what we have to make the case to, because I think that the assumption is we don't tax that wealth because those people are in the best position to decide where it should go. And that really is the key assumption, I think. I've written a lot about the right and its economic ideas, and that really is the key thing. Like, why do you leave money in the hands of rich people because they are in the best position to make the decisions about what to do with that money for the good of everybody. Like, that's the case. And I think it's a bad argument. And I think we should make it, because that produces a situation where we now have over 100,000 people dead in a very short period of time. That's because of these decisions about where wealth gets invested. So I think that should really be confronted and thought through, head on, and so forth. What are we going to all agree to do? I mean, I can't decide that for all of us. But this is the conversation that needs to be had, not just in phone calls, but in the institutions that represent us and that claim to represent us. And so, I think that, but I'm not trying to punt on that question. It's more recognizing that I'm not the person to make that call, but I think it's the absolutely right question, because I've been part of these conversations for many years, and it always, again, a lot of well-meaning communiques come out of them, and new understanding. And I'm an educator, so I believe in understanding, but understanding that's not attached to an action might as well have never happened. It'll just disappear. And I think that's what we are facing here, is the possible disappearance of this institution. And so I think we've probably got the understanding, and now it is a question of tying it to some kind of action that's genuinely collective, and that is not just social media posts, and is not just a small group of people, but is genuinely collective in mass.
We have time for just one more question, Debbie, if we have it.
Yeah. So there's a few comments here that tie into this question, that there's this is potentially an opportunity for increasing enrollment because CUNY is still wildly affordable compared to most other institutions, and it's local, which is compelling in the COVID age. But related to that, if there is an uptick on enrollment, how on earth is this ever going to align with slashing adjunct faculty? Could a pragmatically based argument for funding be couched in these terms?
There is, there is no way CUNY can do what it currently is doing by slashing adjuncts. It's not possible. And I don't, this is obviously a live issue right now. I don't know what's going to happen in the fall. There's been a lot of pressure to increase class sizes. And if we actually go back to campus in the fall, I don't know where people imagine these bigger classes are supposed to meet. And again, I would encourage everybody to read the UPenn president's plan, because it's so thoughtful and careful about these sorts of issues. And it shows you what we're not doing at CUNY, not because we have bad leaders, but because we don't because we lack resources. But it's important to keep those things in mind. But I mean, I've seen some of the plans, for cutting adjuncts. And I think Ben Lerner says this in his op-ed today. You're talking about huge budgetary holes in theory. We don't yet know what they are. And you're cutting the adjunct budget. It's like a drop in the bucket to cut, to filling, I'm sorry, I'm mixing all my metaphors here, but, to filling up that gap. And so you're not doing that much in terms of redressing the budgetary issue. And yet you're gutting the educational mission at the very same time. It's just, I'll admit I'm not, an administrator, and I don't envy the position of many administrators. But that particular transaction, I find it hard to make sense of. You're going to do a tiny ripple, you're going to do something that's going to have a very small effect on the budget, but will have a massive effect on our students. And all of us who, and I'll be quiet because I know we're running out of time here, but all of us who have been involved in online education this term, the amount that students require of us, which was already a lot and we weren't giving, is even more so when it's online. It's even more so. So it's just it doesn't seem to be the moment to me to be cutting, both for financial reasons, but also just, what the hell are we doing here? Why are we here in the first place? Kind of reasons.
Corey, thank you very much. You know, this was neither the beginning nor the end of a conversation, but you made a significant contribution, I think, for all of us by writing the article that you did in the New Yorker, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I think you added a depth to the ways we're thinking about some of this that's really important at this moment. And I hope we can continue the conversation at the Colin Powell School over time, both about what's going on within CUNY, but also a series that we've begun around, you know, how across our society we respond to this pandemic. But this was great. Corey, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who joined us. We did record this and we'll be posting it to our YouTube, and we'll send out the link. So folks who didn't get to hear all of it, or if you want to share it, please feel free to. Take care, be well, have a good afternoon. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.